So picking up where we left off, we're discussing the significance of price elasticity of demand, remembering that elasticity is about responsiveness, sensitivity to changes in price. So how much will demand contract or expand in accordance with a price change? Remembering that contractions, we're talking about when price goes up and the quantity goes down, and expansions are where price goes down and quantity goes up. Now, the responsiveness or sensitivity to the price change is exactly that. We need to start referring to it as elasticity. And you've got to start thinking about it in terms of an elastic band that has a lot of stretch. So the more elastic, the more sensitive a product is to changes in price, the greater the impact price changes are going to have on the revenue for the business. Now, in terms of significance, that's leading into why it is important, why price elasticity is significant. It's not so much about the consumer, that the consumer needs to know how elastic demand is. It's not about consumers knowing or being aware of price elasticity of demand. It's really about firms and governments having an understanding of how sensitive consumers are to price changes. If the demand for a good is elastic, has a lot of stretch, very sensitive, very responsive to a price change, then that means the demand for the product is going to go down when price goes up. And how much that goes down affects the bottom line for all businesses, anyone providing a good or a service. It is going to affect their revenue levels. So they need to be aware of this when they're determining their price strategy, if they're deciding whether they're going to change prices, and for governments when they're deciding about pricing goods and services that are collective in nature, that they provide for communities, like even something as simple as, bus fares or train fares. It's going to have an impact on government revenue, especially if they're goods that they're considering adding taxes to, because that will increase the price. So, for all of those reasons, businesses are going to need to know how responsive consumers are to price changes, and that's determined by the type of good that we're dealing with. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the only way to find that out is through market research generally. That's how firms would become aware of how elastic demand is for their good or service. Now, there are two extreme versions of elasticity that really don't exist in reality. They're very theoretical. I guess they're like the unicorns of economics, or demand economics anyway. So you've got this extreme, perfectly elastic, that's a completely horizontal 180, and then you've got this extreme where it's perfectly inelastic, and that's a total 90-degree line in terms of, you know, back to mathematics with our 90-degree angle here. So perfectly elastic, you can see here, one price, many quantities, meaning that there are no quantities demanded at a price that's above here, and no quantity is demanded at a price below that price. So there's only one price at which consumers will demand that product. Now, the only kind of example that might exist in real life The only one I could think of was seasonal fruit. In the peak season for a particular fruit, like let's say pears, everyone knows they're around in, say, February, March every year, and everyone knows that they might have a standard price at all the fruit shops, all the supermarkets during that peak period. No one is willing to pay more than, say, $1 a kilo for pears at that particular time. So that's one of those examples where price is set, it's very elastic, and if Woolworths has got it at the dollar, and they know that the fruit shop across the road and the fruit shop in the shopping center and their corner shop are all selling pears for about that dollar, then that's how it would work. Anyone who's selling that product at $1.50 a kilo is not going to get any sales happening. That kind of price increase is something they would be very responsive to. Perhaps even $1.10 a kilo, they would be really responsive to it. Now, again, not the best example, but it's just to illustrate the idea of how perfect elasticity works. Now, perfectly inelastic kind of exists in real life when you think about there being a limited quantity available. So consumers are paying any price to obtain that quantity. The example I could think of was, I guess, when you've got, I don't know, let's say there's a particular suburb that's very trendy that everybody wants to live in, and the houses in that suburb or on that street all um, are very, I guess, the demand for those homes, very inelastic, very non-responsive to any price increases, and the price just keeps going higher and higher to obtain that quantity that is available. Again, no real life examples actually exist for this. So I just wanted to reiterate that. There are no real life examples in the truest sense of the word. Now, what does exist are three types that sit somewhere in between those two extremes that we looked at. So, in between the horizontal and the vertical, there are a couple of different slopes that give us an indication of elasticity, or what we call relatively elastic or relatively inelastic, as opposed to perfectly elastic or inelastic. Now, relatively elastic demand means that there's been a strong response to a change in price. So the slope is getting close to being horizontal. Not perfectly elastic, so it's not the 180, but it's pretty close to being horizontal compared with vertical. So that means there's been a strong response to change. The elastic is stretching a little bit further out there. So that's relatively elastic demand. Now, relatively inelastic demand, that means there's been a weak response to a change in price. So whether the price was here and that was the quantity, the price goes up and that's the quantity. Quantity really hasn't changed that much because it's a pretty steep curve. So the steeper the slope, the gradient, the closer it is to being almost vertical, remembering that vertical was the completely, perfectly inelastic demand we looked at, the unicorn we saw before. This one is as close to vertical as we're going to get. That means there's a weak response to a change in price. All of these will have more meaning when we talk about specific goods that I guess we associate with inelasticity and elasticity. Now, the other type of demand that we can have, the other type of elasticity we refer to. So if it's not, like I said, we don't see perfectly elastic, we don't see perfectly inelastic, we see a variation of this that we refer to as relatively elastic, and we see a variation of perfectly inelastic that we refer to as relatively inelastic, and then we have our one for ones that I like to call well, I call them one for ones, but that's unit elastic demand. And that's when there's a proportional response to a price in change. So it's more of a 45-degree angle. So, you know, let's say we're starting here, this quantity, that price, next price up here is bringing this quantity, next price up here is bringing that quantity. So it's a bit more uniform. That is what we talk about being unit elastic demand. Now, as I said, this has more meaning when we look at specific products. So I'm just going to jump ahead for a second and talk about those specific products, just so that you can have some idea about what we're talking about. Now, the factors that are going to affect demand elasticity, well, is the product a necessity or is it a luxury? Because if it's a necessity, that means I need it no matter how. So if we jump ahead now and actually apply this to specific products so that we can understand or gain understanding about how we talk about elasticity or inelasticity, it helps to look at specific products. Now, in your textbooks and in the syllabus, this is separated into 4 headings. So we have our necessities and luxuries. Now, if a product is a necessity, that means I need it no matter what. Despite any price increases, I still have to buy it. Let's say bread. So that means price is inelastic for bread because it's a necessity. I do not respond, other consumers do not respond in a huge way to the price increase of bread because all of our homes are buying it. Same as milk, for example. Now, luxuries are a different thing altogether because luxuries, as prices increase for luxury items, less and less people can afford them. So, demand is definitely going to be responsive to a price increase. Now, in your textbook, there's a 5th heading, whereas you'll notice here I've only got 4, A, B, C, D. The reason your textbook has a 5th heading is because they talk about habit forming and addictive products separately. I choose to place this in here under necessity and luxury because a level of addiction or the level of habit forming nature or characteristics of a product determine whether a person sees the product as a necessity or a luxury. Perhaps I'm being oversimplistic about it, but for a person who's addicted to cigarettes or alcohol, they are not going to be responsive to a price change. So it is considered a necessity for them, and any increase in price is not going to change their demand for the product. So it's relatively inelastic. The existence of close substitutes is, of course, going to affect how people respond to a price increase. Now, if there's a close substitute for the product, I can get it somewhere else cheaper, then I respond. I will buy less. Consumers will buy less. Consumers will not take the price increase. They will go somewhere else for the substitute that has a lower price and not take the price increase. If there's no close substitute, then demand will be inelastic. They can't get it anywhere else, so the price increase has no impact on the consumer's purchase of the product, on the consumer's demand for the product. And an example of that is, let's say, energy, electricity. It doesn't matter how much we hear about on the news, electricity's gone up, electricity's gone up, electricity's gone up. Have any of you switched your lights off at home? We might change a little bit of our habit with regard to to our usage habits, but nobody has switched off electricity in their homes necessarily. Well, not on the grand scale anyway. Now, how big a chunk the product's price takes of your income also affects elasticity. Now, if we're talking about small price items, low price items, let's say a pen, that doesn't really take up a huge chunk or proportion of my income, then demand is going to be relatively inelastic. If the price of a pen went up from 70 cents to 80 cents or $3 to $3 or $3.50, it's not like everyone's going to buy less pens now because they've gone up. Okay, it's not a huge portion of their income, and it's not that frequently that they're buying it anyway. Now, if it's a high price item that takes up a high proportion of their income, then it will be responsive. Consumers will be responsive to the price change, and it will be a relatively elastic demand for that product. Consumers will be sensitive if it takes up a chunk of their income. I guess an example of that could be rent. The higher the rent is, and the higher the rent increase is, it may push them towards alternatives and away from the rent at that particular home. I guess that's the only real life example that's coming to mind right now. You could probably think of more. The other thing that the syllabus alerts us to is that the length of time since a price change also impacts elasticity of demand. Now, if the price change was recent, in the short term, demand will be relatively inelastic because there won't be such a stretch in response to the price increase because perhaps consumers haven't had a chance to shop around yet and look for a substitute or a close substitute. So in the short term, they're gonna take the price hit. But if there's been a long time since the price change now, then it may become more elastic over time because now consumers have looked, have shopped around, have found alternatives or a way to deal with it, a way to avoid the price increase, and their demand has contracted in accordance with that. Now, next, we're going to look at how we calculate this concept of elasticity. It's not very difficult, just stay tuned.